They said the trip was canceled. I saw the photos before the plane even landed. They excluded me like I wouldn't notice. But I booked every seat, and when I canceled everything, they learned exactly who'd been footing the bill. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with, saved for years to give them the trip of a lifetime. They gave my seat to my brother without hesitation. They told me I'd understand. I did. I understood that I was never really invited in the first place. They wanted his to go. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience instead of me. So I let them. And then I canceled everything. "You're late," my dad said, as he stepped out onto the porch, pulling his suitcase behind his. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. It was 6:02 a.m. 2 minutes late. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth, Dad. I said, forcing a smile. I got out of the car to help with the luggage. But then I saw my brother Brian emerging from the house with his own suitcase in tow. My smile froze. "What's going on?" I asked. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Keep my voice steady. My dad turned to me here, expression far too cheerful for the situation. "Oh, Lucas Brennan, we decided Brian should come instead of you. She's been so stressed lately and he really needs this trip." My chest tightened. "Instead of me, Dad." They mistook my generosity for submission, and that was their mistake. I've been planning this for years. I paid for everything. He waved his hand dismissively as if I just pointed out something trivial, and we're grateful, sweetheart. But you're always working so hard you can take another trip later. Brian needs this right now. Brian, sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. Didn't even have the decency to look guilty. He just smirked, shifting his weight onto one hip. "Thanks for understanding, sis," he said, his tone dripping with fake gratitude. I stared at the two of them, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad shuffled. "You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First out of datant, later avoiding eye contact as he handed me his suitcase. This is unbelievable," I said, my voice shaking. "This was supposed to be our trip, something for me to share with you." "Well, it still is," my dad said with a "this wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Smile just with Brian instead. Don't make this a big deal, Lucas. Brennan, your brother, really needs a break. My name is Violet, and for the past 2 years I've been working overtime, saving every spare penny to give my parents a trip they'd never forget. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. Flights, luxury hotels, guided tours. I planned every detail down to the last dinner reservation. But as I stood there in my parents' driveway watching my brother get into the back seat of my car, I realized something I'd been avoiding for years. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First matter how much effort I put in their eyes, Brian would always come first. I clenched my jaw, biting back the sharp retort sitting on the tip of my tongue. Instead, I forced a tight smile and opened the trunk. "Leighton, get going. Then you can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away first." I said, my voice flat. If they wanted to prioritize his over me, fine. They could go with his, but I wasn't about to let them enjoy it. The drive to the airport was suffocatingly quiet except for Brian's incessant chatter. "Oh my gosh, Dad, you can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away first. Did you see that TikTok about Paris? I can't wait to go shopping there. Do you think we'll have time for that? Or will the tours take up the whole day?" My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I stared straight ahead. "Forcing you. Can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First myself, not to say anything." My dad chuckled softly. "Of course, we'll have time. We'll figure it out when we get there." I bit the inside of my cheek. When we get there, they didn't even seem to notice I wasn't part of that some boundaries are born not out of anger, but out of clarity anymore. At one point, my dad cleared his throat. "Thank you for driving us, Lucas Brennan. I know this probably feels unusual. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Usual, that's an interesting way to put it. Dad. He didn't respond. He just shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held in his seat, probably wishing he hadn't spoken at all. Brian leaned forward from the back seat, his voice grating. You're not mad, right? This is really big of you letting me go. I could never have afforded this on my own. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience. Clenched my jaw and forced a tight smile. Of course, Brian enjoyed the trip by the time we pulled up to the airport drop-off zone. My patience was hanging by a thread as I helped unload their luggage. My dad gave me a hug. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First, thank you for understanding, sweetheart. This means a lot to us. And to Brian. I nodded stiffly. Sure, Dad. Brian beamed as he wheeled his suitcase toward the entrance. Thanks, Lucas Brennan. You're the best. I stood there watching them disappear into the terminal. My chest they mistook my generosity for submission, and that was their mistake, tight with anger and hurt. The ride back home was a blur. I replayed the conversation in my head over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. This means a lot to Brian. You're not mad, right? You're always working so hard. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, until my knuckles turned white then without. A second thought, I marched into the house, pulled out my laptop, and logged into every travel account I'd use. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth, to book the trip, hotel reservations, canceled tours, refunded, airline upgrades. Nope. I stared at the confirmation emails piling up in my inbox, feeling the tightness in my chest start to ease. They wanted to take Brian instead of me. Fine, but they wouldn't be. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away, first staying in 5-star hotels or enjoying private tours on my dime. When I closed my laptop, a sense of satisfaction settled over me. They could explain themselves to the front desk staff in Paris. I was done being their doormat. The call started as soon. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience. As their flight landed, my phone buzzed repeatedly. As I unpacked my suitcase, the one I'd packed so carefully for a trip that was no longer mine, the irony wasn't lost on me as I hung up my dresses and neatly placed my shoes back. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away, first on the shelf. The buzzing continued, filling the room with its relentless vibration. I sighed. Picking up the phone and glancing at the screen, my dad's name flashed across it, accompanied by several missed calls and texts. I unlocked the phone and scrolled through I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. Messages. Lucas Brennan. What's going on? The hotel won't let us check in. The reservation is missing. Call me immediately. Lucas Brennan. This isn't funny. Fix this now. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Fix this. They really thought I'd swoop in and save. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience. The day after what they'd done, the phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Brian. I let it ring out only for his to leave a voicemail. Lucas Brennan. This is so petty, snapped his voice, dripping with entitlement. We're stuck here because I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth of you. You need to call the hotel and fix it now. I rolled my eyes and deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. For years I'd been their fixer, the one who smoothed over every mistake and picked up every slack. Not anymore. Some boundaries are born not out of anger, but out of clarity. Eventually, I decided to answer. If only to stop the barrage of calls. My dad's voice hit me like a tidal wave of anger as soon as I picked up. Lucas Brennan. What did you do? The hotel says the reservation was cancelled, and none of I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. The tours are booked anymore. I let his rant for a dadent, then calmly replied, I cancel them. There was a long, stunned silence before he hissed, Why would you do that? Oh, I don't know. I said, my tone laced with sarcasm. Maybe because this wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. You decided to take Brian on my trip. You're lucky I even drove you to the airport, we thought. You'd understand, he snapped. Understand what I asked, my voice. Rising that years of saving and planning didn't matter because Brian needed a break that sometimes the hardest. Part of letting go is realizing you were never held. Hard work meant nothing to you. Guess what, Dad? I don't understand and I don't care to. I hung up before he could respond and turned my phone off, tossing it onto the couch. The silence that followed was bliss, and I felt like they mistook my generosity for submission. And that was their mistake. Could breathe again if they wanted to prioritize Brian, fine. But they could figure out the rest of the trip. Without me, the silence lasted only a day. By the next morning, my phone was buzzing again with calls and messages. At first I ignored. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held them. I spent the day cleaning the house and catching up on work, but curiosity got the better of me. By evening, I opened my phone and braced myself for the storm of texts from my dad, Lucas Brennan. You've gone too far, your brother is. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I cancelled it to reclaim my worth. In tears. And you're far. This is furious. We can't get into any of the hotels you booked from Brian. You're acting like a child. I don't get why you're making this such a big deal. Just fix it already. And finally, from my dad. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. Need to talk. This isn't right. I set the phone down, shaking my head. For years, I'd been the one to fix things, to make sure everyone was comfortable and happy. Now that I'd taken a step back, they didn't know how to handle it. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, letting the anger simmer. How dare they expect me to clean up their mess? How dare they act like I was the one in the wrong? The next call came minutes. They mistook my generosity for submission. And that was their mistake later. And this time I answered Lucas Brennan. My dad barked before I could say a word. This isn't funny anymore. We're stranded. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? I took a slow sip of my tea. Embarrassing? You think this is embarrassing? They mistook my generosity for submission. And that was their mistake. Try saving for years, planning every detail. And then being told you're not even part of the trip you paid for. Stop being dramatic, he snapped. Brian needed this more than you, and now he can figure it out. I said firmly. They mistook my generosity for submission. And that was their mistake. Decision. Dad, you wanted to take Brian instead of me. Fine, but don't expect me to fund his vacation. We're family, he hissed. We don't do this to each other. I let out a bitter laugh. Funny, I was just thinking the same thing. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. Voice came through the background, whining. Dad, just hang up on she's being impossible. That was the final straw. Enjoy your trip, I said, my tone icy. Oh wait, you can't. Because it's not your trip, it was mine, and now it's nobody's goodbye. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. I hung up before he could respond and turned my phone off again. For the rest of the evening, I felt an odd mix of anger and relief. Anger that they'd put me in this position, but relief that I'd finally stood up for myself. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First, they could call me dramatic, all they wanted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't letting them take advantage of me. The next few days were blissfully quiet. With my phone turned off, I finally had space to think clearly, free from that this wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Barrage of guilt trips and accusations. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on my back porch, enjoying the calm I'd craved for so long. My afternoons were filled with work and catching up on little projects I'd been putting off, things that reminded me how I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. Capable I was, when I wasn't bogged down by their endless demands. but by the third day, curiosity got the better of me. I turned my phone back on to find over a dozen voicemails waiting for me. The first few, from my dad growing sometimes, the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held, increasingly hysterical with each one. Lucas Brennan, you need to call me back, right? Now this has gone too far. I can't believe you're doing this. You've humiliated us. We're your parents. How could you treat us this way? Then came Brian's messages full of the, I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth, same entitled tone she'd always used. This is so petty even for you, you're ruining everything, just fix it. Violet, and finally my dad's voice, quieter but no less pointed. Lucas Brennan, I don't understand what's happened to you. Call us back. So we can sort. They mistook my generosity for submission. And that was their mistake, this out. I hesitated before listening to the final voicemail, along one from my dad. His voice was quieter this time, tinged with frustration and exhaustion. Violet, he began. We're back at the airport now. The trip is ruined, and I hope you're happy this wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with yourself. Your brother is devastated and your Faithis and I are, well, disappointed doesn't even begin to cover it. Call us when you're ready to talk. I deleted the voicemails without replying. I wasn't ready to talk, and honestly, I didn't know if I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth ever would be. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the culmination of years of them putting Brian first and expecting me to accept it with a smile. As the hours passed, I found myself reflecting on all the times I'd been overlooked or dismissed. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Every holiday, where Brian's whims dictated the plans, every family gathering where my accomplishments were treated as afterthoughts. This trip had been the breaking point, but the cracks had been forming for years. That evening, Grace stopped by unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and you can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First, an unmistakable look of curiosity I heard about what happened. He said, setting the coffee on the table, "Your dad called me yesterday." Of course he had. My dad had always been good at recruiting allies when he wanted to guilt-boo me into compliance. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth, and I asked, taking a sip. Grace shrugged, a sly smile creeping across his face. I told us you were probably busy and would get back to his when you were ready. I laughed, shaking my head. You're the best. No, you're the best. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Said, his tone suddenly serious, because you finally stood up for yourself. I know how hard that is. Violet, don't let them drag you back down. His words stuck with me long after he left. Grace was right. I'd spent too long bending over backward. They mistook my generosity for submission, and that was their mistake to please people who never seemed to care about my efforts. It was time to break that cycle once and for all. By the time the weekend rolled around, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still there, simmering under the surface. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with, but it was joined by something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Freedom from their endless expectations. Freedom from being the family's fixer. Freedom to finally live on my own terms. But as expected, the silence didn't last. It was Sunday afternoon when I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. Got a call that I decided to answer this time. It was my dad, Lucas Brennan. He began, his voice heavy with weariness. Your dad wanted me to call. She thinks you'll listen to me. Go on, I said, leaning back in my chair. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. Let out a sigh. Look, this has all gotten out of hand. Your dad's upset, Brian's furious, and, well, it's just a mess, but you're better than this. I stiffened his words, igniting a fresh wave of anger. Better than what? Dad standing up for love without respect isn't love. It's convenience. Myself refusing to let you walk all over me again. That's not what I meant, he said quickly. It's just, you've always been the reasonable one, the one who keeps everything together. This isn't like you. I laughed a short, bitter sound. You're right. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I cancelled it to reclaim my worth. It's not like me, because I'm not bending over backward to clean up your mess. He paused, and for a dadent, I thought he might finally see my side of things, but then he said, "You're punishing the whole family over one decision, is that love without respect isn't love. It's convenience, really. Fair, fair." I repeated my voice. Rising, "You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when you and Dad decided I wasn't important enough to be part of the trip I planned? Was it fair when you replaced me with Brian? This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Didn't matter. That's not what we were trying to do." He said, his tone defensive now. "We just thought Brian needed it more." "Of course you did," I snapped. "You always think he needs more attention, more support, more of everything. And sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. The one expected to sacrifice for is not anymore." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, he said, "I don't know what you want me to say. I don't need you to say anything." I replied, my voice steady. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Just need you to understand that I'm done being the afterthought from now on. I come first. Lucas Brennan. Goodbye, Dad. I ended the call and set the phone down, my hands trembling for the rest of the day. I let myself feel everything: anger, sadness. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. Relief. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the start of something new. I wasn't the family's fixer anymore, and I wasn't going to be. They could figure out how to clean up their own messes. When my parents and Brian finally returned, sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held waiting for them at their house. I'd parked in their driveway, sipping coffee and feeling surprisingly calm as I watched their taxi pull up as they stepped out, dragging their suitcases behind them. Their faces were a mix of exhaustion and irritation. Brian was the "some boundaries are born not out" of anger, but out of clarity. First to speak, "Well, I hope you're happy, Lucas Brennan." I raised an eyebrow, staying seated on the porch swing. "Happy about what? Our trip was a disaster." My dad snapped, waving his hand as if to brush the whole thing away. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth week, staying in dingy hotels and eating terrible food because we couldn't afford anything decent, and don't get me started on the tours, Brian chimed in, crossing his arms. "Oh wait, there weren't any. Do you know how embarrassing it was to show up? You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away first and be told there was no reservation." I took another sip of coffee, letting their complaints wash over me. "Sounds rough," I said, finally my voice calm. "But you wanted to take Brian, remember? I'm sure you all had some great bonding time. That's not. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held the point." My dad shot back, his voice rising. "You knew we couldn't afford all the things you'd planned. You set us up to fail." And I stood up, setting my mug down on the small table next to me. "No, Dad, I didn't set. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held you up for anything. I planned a trip for the three of us, something special I'd been saving for years. You're the ones who decided to cut me out at the last second." My dad finally spoke up, his tone quieter but no less. "Some boundaries are born not out of anger, but out of clarity." Accusatory. "You didn't have to cancel everything, Lucas Brennan. That was extreme." "Was it?" I asked, folding my arms. "Why should I have paid for a trip I wasn't even invited to? If Brian needed it so badly, you should have planned it. Yourselves you are. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First, lucky that I didn't cancel the return flight." Brian rolled his eyes. "You're so dramatic, it's just money, Lucas Brennan, and you're so entitled." I shot back, my patience finally snapping. "Do you have any idea how much work and sacrifice went into planning that trip? Some boundaries are born not out of anger, but out of clarity? Or do you just assume things magically appear for you because someone else takes care of it?" They stood there, stunned into silence for a dadent. I've spent years being the responsible one. I continued, my voice steady but firm. The one who fixes. They mistook my generosity for submission. And that was their mistake. Things plans things, make sure everything runs smoothly, and you've spent just as long taking it all for granted. That's not fair, my dad started, but I held up a hand to stop his no, Dad. What's not fair is how you treated me. You love without respect isn't love. It's convenience. Chose Brian over me like always, so I chose to stop being your doormat. You didn't want me on the trip, fine, but you don't get to enjoy the benefits of my hard work without me. I grabbed my bag from the porch swing, and you can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away. First, turn to leave. I'm glad you're back safely, but don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I'm done. As I walked to my car, I heard them calling after me. Their voices a mix of anger and guilt, but I didn't sometimes. The hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. Look back, the drive home from my parents' house felt strange, peaceful for years. Every visit had left me emotionally drained, but this time I felt lighter. I'd finally said everything I'd been holding in, and for once I wasn't worried about their reaction when I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. I got back to my house. I made a cup of tea and sat on the couch replaying the confrontation in my head. They'd been so sure I'd fold that I'd give in like always, but watching their stunned faces as I walked away this wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen, to begin with a reminder of how much I'd changed. They could be angry, hurt, or embarrassed. It didn't matter anymore. I was done living my life to meet their expectations the next day. I got a call from Grace. How it go, he asked. Not bothering. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience with pleasantries. I laughed, leaning back against the kitchen counter, exactly like you'd imagine their furious Brian pouting, and Dad is probably trying to figure out how to guilt me back into line. Grace let out a snort. Let his try. You've got a backbone. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth now, and I'm here to make sure it stays in place. I grinned, grateful for his unwavering support. Thanks, Grace. I mean it. You've been my rock through all of this anytime, he said, his voice softening. So what's next for you, now that I didn't cancel the trip out of spite? I canceled it to reclaim my worth. You're not playing family fixer anymore. That question had been circling in my mind since the confrontation. What was next for years? So much of my energy had been poured into trying to please my family, trying to earn their approval now, that I'd let some boundaries are born not out of anger, but out of clarity, go of that burden. The possibilities felt endless and a little intimidating. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I feel like I get to decide. Not them, not anyone else, just me. Sounds like the start of something. Amazing, Grace said, and I could. Some boundaries are born, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Hear the smile in his voice. Over the next few weeks, I started making small changes that felt big in their own way. I redecorated my living room, swapping out the hand-me-down furniture from my parents for pieces that felt uniquely mine. The hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. Spent weekends exploring local cafes and parks, things I'd always meant to do, but never made time for, and I started journaling, writing down my thoughts and dreams, without filtering them through the lens of what anyone else might think. Each small step felt like some boundaries are born, not out of anger, but out of clarity, reclaiming a part of myself. I hadn't realized I'd lost one. Evening, I sat down with my laptop and opened the spreadsheet I'd used to plan the trip. The canceled reservations stared back at me, and I didn't feel a pang of regret. Instead, I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. Felt a surge of determination that money had been meant for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I wasn't going to let it go to waste. Closing the spreadsheet, I opened a new browser tab and typed solo travel ideas. A few weeks after my parents' return, this wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. I booked a solo trip to Italy. It wasn't the same itinerary I'd planned for them, and it wasn't about proving a point anymore. This was for me a chance to celebrate my independence and finally put myself first the day I landed in some boundaries, are born not out of anger. But out of clarity, Rome, I felt a surge of excitement and nervousness. I'd never traveled alone before, but as I stepped out of the airport and into the bustling city, I knew I'd made the right decision. I spent my days wandering cobblestone streets, marveling at ancient ruins. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience and indulging in meals. At charming little cafes, there was no schedule, no one else to consider, just me, and the freedom to do exactly what I wanted one afternoon while sitting on the Spanish steps with a gelato in hand. I pulled out sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held the journal I'd brought with me for years. I had written about what I wanted to achieve, but those dreams were always wrapped up in making someone else happy. Now, as I wrote, the focus shifted. Learn a new language, start a small business, travel. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience to at least 5 more countries. The list grew, each goal a reflection of the life I wanted to create, not the one I'd been expected to live on my last night in Florence. I had dinner at a small family-run restaurant overlooking the "you can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away" First Arno River. As I watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace. This trip had been more than just a vacation. It was a turning point. I'd spent so much of my life trying. You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away first to earn my family's approval. But here, thousands of miles away, I realized something important. I didn't need it. I was enough just as I was. When I returned home, my parents tried to reach out again, this time with softer tones and carefully worded, "You can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away." First messages: "Hope you had a nice trip." One text from my dad read, "Maybe we can all talk soon." I stared at the message for a dadn't before setting my phone down. I wasn't ready to reply, and that was okay. This time it would. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with. Be on my terms. As I unpacked my suitcase and placed souvenirs on my shelves, I felt a sense of pride. A week after returning from my trip, I received a call from my dad. This time, I answered. "Hi, Violet," he began, his tone. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with, unusually soft. "How was your trip?" "It was amazing," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "That's good to hear," he said, pausing as if searching for the right words. "We've been thinking a lot about what happened. Maybe we handled things poorly." The admission surprised. This wasn't about being left out. It was about never being chosen to begin with me, but I wasn't ready to let his off the hook just yet. "Poorly, you replaced me on a trip I planned and paid for without even asking." Poorly is an understatement. "I know," he said quietly. "Your dad and we didn't realize how you can only be left behind so many times before you choose to walk away first. Much it would hurt you. And Brian," I asked, "does he feel bad too? Or is he still blaming me for ruining his vacation?" "She's upset," my dad admitted, "but I think he knows he could have handled things better." I sighed, leaning against. They mistook my generosity for submission, and that was their mistake. The counter, "Dad, this wasn't just about the trip. It's about years of putting his first and expecting me to pick up the slack. I'm not doing it anymore." "I understand," he said after a dadn't. "We're going to try to do better. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. Want to lose you, his word." Words tugged at something deep inside me, but I'd learned enough not to let guilt dictate my choices. "I'm glad to hear that," I said. "But it's going to take more than words to fix this. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth. See, real effort, not just apologies. He promised, "We'll give you the space you need, but I hope you'll let us back in someday." After the call, I felt a mix of emotions: relief that they were finally acknowledging their behavior, and skepticism. I didn't cancel the trip out of spite. I canceled it to reclaim my worth, about whether they'd actually change. But as I sat down with My journal that evening, I realized something important. With this or not they changed wasn't my responsibility over the following months. I kept my boundaries firm. I responded to their calls and texts when you can only be left behind so many times. Before you choose to walk away, first felt like it. But I didn't go out of my way to fix things or smooth over conflicts. Instead, I focused on building the life I wanted. I signed up for a photography class, something I'd always dreamed of doing, but never had the time. Love without respect isn't love. It's convenience or energy. For I joined a local hiking group and even started planning my next solo trip. Each step I took felt like reclaiming another part of myself one day as I sat on my porch watching the sunset. I realized how far I'd come. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing you were never held. I wasn't the person who bent over backward for people who didn't appreciate me. I was someone who valued himself, who set boundaries, and who wasn't afraid to stand up for what he deserved. I felt truly free.